during those 40 years, we gradually saw obesity in children emerge as an issue, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease. And I like to say that I followed the yellow brick road, meaning I followed the data. And so we started getting interested in just factors in general that were contributing to this continuous rise in chronic diseases. And it kept coming back to diet and it kept coming back to sugar. Not to say that was the only factor, but it was a recurring factor in multiple studies and papers that we worked on. And it became a recurring factor that is something that we can do something about.
Welcome to the Soaring Child podcast, where parents of children with ADHD learn tips and tricks to help their child soar at home, at school, and in life. We feature interviews with experts, medical professionals, and parents just like you who are learning how to reduce ADHD symptoms using food and other natural strategies. Because children with ADHD deserve to soar just like every other child. I'm Dana Kay, your host. Hello, parents. This is Dana Kay here with another edition of the Soaring Child podcast. Now, as you know, I like to tell stories, and this episode is no different. I want to tell you about a story when we first actually moved to the USA. I saw an ad for the Washington State Fair, and I just could not wait to take my boys and my husband. You know, it was a traditional American fair. We were all so excited. You know how it is, like those bright lights, all the carnival games, and of course, endless amounts of cotton candy. Can I just tell you, in Australia, we actually call it fairy floss, but here in America, cotton candy, ice cream, sugary treats. And, you know, like many parents, I thought, it's just one day. What harm could it do? Oliver was having, the time of his life. And honestly, I really didn't think too much about the sugar overload that was happening sort of behind the scenes or in the background. But when we got home, the meltdown came. And by the end of the day, that sugar crash just hit so hard. And, Oliver was super hyperactive normally, but he was manageable. But he was in full meltdown mode, emotional, unable to focus, totally on edge. And it wasn't just sort of like that exhaustion that came from being out all day. It was something more than that. And that day when I look back, I realized just how powerful sugar can be, not just in causing sort of, quick energy spikes, but completely throwing off, his mood, his focus, his behavior for the rest of the day and probably into the next 2, 3, 4 days after that. So today we're diving into a topic that affects all of us, not just children, but especially our children, and that's sugar. Now, we all know that excess sugar isn't great, but do we really understand just how hidden and dangerous it can actually be, particularly when it comes to our kids' health and behavior? So to really help us uncover the truth about sugar and provide some practical solutions, I'm thrilled to welcome Michael Goran to the show. Michael is actually the author of the book Sugar Proof: Protect Your Family from the Hidden Dangers of Excess Sugar with Simple Everyday Fixes. So, I mean, if anyone's going to come on this show to talk about this, I think he's the man. He's not just an expert, but he's a leading voice in childhood nutrition research. And he has spent the past 35 years investigating the impact of sugar on children, publishing over, just listen to this, 400 scientific papers and raising 80 million in research funding. I mean, that is mind-blowing. He's also a professor and vice chair of research at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, among so many other accomplishments. So today we're gonna dive deep and talk about how excess sugar is sneaking into our kids' diet and the simple steps that you guys can take to protect them from the harmful effects. Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Wow, thank you. Pleasure to be here. And thank you for that introduction. That was very generous. Thank you so much.
Oh, honestly, I can't believe when originally read and heard about you, 400 scientific papers. That's amazing. 80 million in research funding. I'm actually curious to start off. What actually inspired you to focus on sugar and its impact on children's health?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't start off that way. It started off just focused generally on childhood nutrition and trying to understand how nutrition affected health. And yeah, and when I started off in this field in the late 80s, there wasn't a lot of cause of or concern about childhood obesity or diabetes. During those 40 years, we gradually saw obesity in children emerge as an issue, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease. And I like to say that I followed the yellow brick road, meaning I followed the data. And so we started getting interested in just factors in general that were contributing to this continuous rise in chronic diseases. And it kept coming back to diet and it kept coming back to sugar. Not to say that was the only factor, but it was a recurring factor in multiple studies and papers that we worked on. And it became a recurring factor that is something that we can do something about. So it's a modifiable factor. And so the book came about because that research added up to something, but not very many people read those research papers. Those 400 research papers have probably, only reached several thousand people's eyes, but yet the findings were so important. So that's why I wanted to translate all those findings into something practical and useful.
That's amazing to hear that journey. I just want to touch on something that you said, and you've done this over such a long period of time. Have you noticed? You've obviously seen an increase in all of these diseases and disorders. Has the industry changed around sugar? Like, has sugar changed from what it used to be? Has the way they use sugar in food changed from how it was 40 years ago to what it is now?
Oh, yeah, it's changed quite a lot. Probably 40 years ago, I mean, nobody was really tracking it, but sugar was sugar. Now there's over 200 different names for sugar that the industry has come up with. I mean, the advent of high fructose corn syrup came during that period, and that is not the only issue now. There's many, many other types of sugar. And now the story is turning to non-sugar sweeteners, so alternative sweeteners like your stevia, monk fruit, aspartame, sucralose. That's where the story is going now, as the industry's saying, okay, yeah, we need to reduce sugar in our products. And then the solution they're coming up with is to replace it with some of these other products, which are introducing a whole other host of problems and concerns as well. So it is changing, but not for the better.
No, it's really interesting to hear that. And I you always hear grandparents, I know with all the families that I work with, we'll hear from families to say, oh, our grandparents, or our parents don't want to implement some of these changes because, when they were growing up, this was not an issue. But, you've just reiterated there, yeah, that's because it was actually just real sugar. Now it's probably laden with chemicals and processing and the amount. And one of the biggest shocks that I actually found when moving to the US is that sugar was in bread. In Australia, there's no sugar in bread.
Yeah, we call that, those sources of hidden sugar showing up in places where you don't expect it to be. So, that's definitely part of the changing landscape is sugars, sweeteners showing up across the food supply. So yeah, it's not just more sugar, it's different types of sugar in different places. Juice is another advent. So, kids weren't drinking as much juice as they are now it's a major source of hydration, surpassing water and milk. And there's more.
Well, on that juice, parents, I know a lot of the parents that come to work with me, think that juice is a natural sweetener or fruit juices are actually healthier options. Maybe can you break down for our listeners why that might not always be the case?
Yeah, it's confusing for many people, and that's because whole fruit by itself. Let's consider eating an apple. There's natural sugars in that fruit. We call that whole food in its natural source, but so it's not that much, and it's broken down very slowly, and it has a minimal effect on the body. The main source of sugar in fruit is fructose.
Mm-hmm.
But when you liberate those sugars from the apple into something like apple juice, you can take a glass of apple juice, which might have the sugars from 3 or 4 apples, minus all of the fiber and all the other healthy nutrients which have been thrown away. So you've liberated the sugars, you've concentrated them, and those sugars are mostly fructose.
Mm-hmm.
Most parents probably know the dangers and risks of high fructose corn syrup and know, to avoid it. But what our studies have shown is that there's more fructose in apple juice than in soda made with high fructose corn syrup.
Wow.
But yet it's called apple juice or fruit juice, so it comes with this healthy halo around it that really kind of obscures and hides the real contents and the potential risks and damages of all those sugars. Now, that's not to say a glass of apple juice is okay, but we're talking about major amounts of juice throughout the day, and it adds up. And it's all to do with how those sugars are processed by the body.
Mm-hmm. Can you dive a little bit deeper into that for the listeners?
Yeah. So ordinary sugar is what we call a disaccharide. It's a molecule of glucose joined to a molecule of fructose. The glucose is what the body uses for energy. So it is an essential nutrient in healthy, moderate amounts. That's what the brain uses for energy. But the fructose is not used directly for energy. If you consume a small amount of it, then some of that fructose can be converted to glucose and then used for energy. But when you consume a large amount of it, like you would in a glass of apple juice or a soda, then that fructose, the body doesn't know what to do with it. Most of it gets taken up by the liver. And the job of the liver is to kind of filter everything that gets absorbed and take out all the nasty stuff like drugs and toxins and all that, alcohol. Fructose gets handled exactly the same way as would happen with alcohol, which means it's filtered by the liver and broken down and converted into fat. So the liver converts that sugar into fat and produces a lot of inflammatory products along the way. So the processing by the body of fructose when it's coming in high amounts is very problematic for the body.
Okay, no, thank you for that explanation. It actually breaks it down and highlights the importance of the difference between the two, and I think that's important for everyone to understand. Now, okay, so we're having a lot of this fructose. Our bodies are not able to cope with it. What are some of the most common health impacts that you've seen in your research and on a daily basis of like excess sugar, in our children?
Yeah, I think you could separate those out into like maybe the clinical outcomes and the everyday outcomes, maybe subclinical or, not actual disease. So on the clinical side, You've got excess weight gain. That's only a bit of the story. We got type 2 diabetes or risk of type 2 diabetes, risk of cardiovascular disease, because that, most people think it's excess fats that causes heart disease. Well, I just said that the excess fructose is converted to fat,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where you get the link between sugars and heart disease. And then the new kid on the block is fatty liver disease,
Mm-hmm.
which is now the leading cause of liver disease in children and adults. And that, I said that the liver converts the fructose into fat. Some of that fat just kind of gets stuck in the liver and it builds up in the liver, and eventually the liver can't do its job, which is an important job of kind of filtering everything that gets ingested. And so that's what would cause liver disease. So those are the clinical things, and those conditions are all like steadily rising.
I'm curious actually on the fatty liver disease. When I think of that, I don't associate it with children at all. And I think, oh my gosh, if a child is diagnosed with fatty liver disease, that's just absolutely awful. So I'm curious on that rise, back, let's just say a couple of years ago, oh, not a couple of years ago, more like, 20, 30 years ago, was it a thing in children?
Well, as recently as maybe you don't have to go that far back, actually, less than 15 or 20 years ago, or sorry, 15 or 20 years ago wasn't such a thing.
Yeah.
Now it's rapidly becoming a thing and a problem. And I work at Children's Hospital with my colleagues who run the liver clinics, and we have a whole clinic just for fatty liver disease where they see kids as young as 6 or 7 years of age. So very problematic, especially among overweight kids, especially among Latino kids. It seems to be more problematic. Also, new studies showing related to food insecurity as well, processed foods, cheap foods. So yeah, it's really an issue. And again, it's preventable and avoidable.
Yeah, definitely preventable and avoidable. And, who doesn't feel better when they eat better? We have a lot of families, thinking, well, how can diet just change and reduce some of these symptoms? But the fact is, it can. And it is an easy, well, not easy, especially living in the USA with the amount of sugar around, but it is totally doable and preventable for sure. So you were talking about the clinical side. What about the subclinical side of things?
Yeah, and just before I get into that, just to answer that question, it is often hard to comprehend because it's a very slowly evolving chronic issue. It's not like your kid got home from the fair with his, in the UK we'd call that candy floss. It's not like they're going to wake up with diabetes,
Yeah.
thankfully, right?
Yeah.
But if they continue along that journey, eventually, chronically over 10 or 20 years, so it's kind of like putting the classic metaphor of the frog in the slowly boiling water. Like,
Ooh.
you don't see it, it's not an immediate danger, but eventually it will become a danger. But yeah, so on the other side, we have, more subtle effects like issues with memory and learning, ability to concentrate, ultimately effects on how the brain develops, increased risk of infections, which we learned about during the COVID days, that sugar was really one thing that was increasing or decreasing people's immunity or lack of immunity, skin problems, ADHD. I mean, there's not direct evidence for that, but we know, and I'm sure you and your listeners know, that it can help improve the symptoms.
I mean, you said right when you started talking about the subclinical focus. memory. These are all the things that are affected or, are ADHD symptoms. So we know that sugar can cause a lot of those problems. Can we just dive deep a little bit into that? Can you just talk to me about how sugar can impact brain development? How does it affect a child's brain, their mood and behavior over time?
Yeah, and it's hard to study these things. And there is some evidence that, and it's, still not totally clear on whether sugar itself can itself trigger hyperactivity in kids. Some evidence suggests it would. But remember, I forget, what is it, 90% of brain development's occurring in the first 5 or 6 years of age. And studies are showing that excess sugar during that period can alter the paths in which the brain develops. One study, it's not a human study, but for example, my colleagues doing very careful controlled studies in animal models showing that excess sugar consumption only during the period of the animal's life when the brain is developing, which is rapidly occurring in the adolescent rat brain. Sugar exposure during that period can have long-lasting effects, even if you just have the adolescent rat consume excess sugar during its 20 days of puberty.
Wow.
And then take it away. You can then detect effects of that on the brain when that rat becomes an adult, including poor memory performance, for example.
Wow.
So sugar is affecting the area of the brain called the hippocampus. It can cause inflammation in that part of the brain, which can be damaging to the ability of that brain to do its job.
Yeah, it can have some pretty powerful effects. And I'm sure that, I'm my son is going through puberty right now, and he's 14 and a half. And so he's in that prime. It doesn't last for 20 days though. I wish it did. So, it's like anything with diet, and lifestyle and all these sort of changes. In your experience and your research, what have you found to be some of the most, I don't know, effective ways to reduce sugar in children's diet, without sort of causing that stress for the parents or the kids?
Yeah, and a lot of times it's kind of contextual, depends on the family, the age of
Yeah.
the kids, and all that. Many factors involved. One thing parents do have control over, for your 14-year-old, you have no control what's happening in school or on the playground or when he goes out with his friends. So, what you bring into the house is important, and how
100%.
you model that in the house is important. You don't really have a lot of control the older they get. But one thing that we found in our book, we talk about this 7-day no added sugar challenge. We don't promote sugar avoidance completely, because I just don't think that's sustainable.
Completely agree.
And I think food is there to be enjoyed and celebrated with, and it's important that you take your family to the fair and have a good time, right? And I think it might not have been as good of a time if you had said, no candy floss, sorry, this is not going to happen. So there's the no added sugar challenge is a way to kind of dial back how our bodies are just craving sugar. Like kids are born with this innate preference for sugar. It's supposed to be protective from an evolutionary perspective.
Really?
Yeah. And so we have to acknowledge that. Food companies have acknowledged it, and that's why food companies make kids' food sweeter, because they know they'll like it more. But the no added sugar challenge is an attempt to try and dial that back a little bit. And you can, and our success with that is documented in the book. And that process is just a period of 7 days where you say, okay, folks, we're not going to consume any added sugars during this period. I'm stressing added sugars. So
can you explain what added sugars means to the listeners?
Added sugars means that sugar in the bread that you mentioned, or the added sugars in pasta sauce or soda. Technically, juice is not added sugars, but we would call that an added sugar. We'd rather you eat the apple, not drink the apple. So the sugars in whole fruit are okay, and the natural sugars in milk and cheese are okay. It's the added sugars. So you take all those out, which means you have to go right now to your pantry and find the bread, the pasta sauce, the yogurt, the ketchup, and look and see, oh, this has added sugar in it. We're not going to consume that. And that alone is going to be helpful because it will help you understand and realize where all the sugar is coming from. And so you go for a week without these added sugars, and the first day or two might be pretty miserable.
Yep.
As you can imagine,
yes,
you might be with a 14-year-old or a 5-year-old. But once you get over that initial day or two of rebellion, the experience shows that kids and adults will emerge with a reduced craving for sweetness and a much clearer level-headed thinking. So we actually have kids that went through the program, for example, who were off to school with their sugary, and their typical breakfasts, sugary cereal, juice, whatever. But on the no added sugar challenge, they had a no added sugar breakfast and were then reporting being able to concentrate for longer, not falling asleep in school after the first few hours. So to come back to your question, what you can do, this is probably the best thing you can do. Now, it does require, it's not going to happen overnight. You have to plan it.
Yeah.
So at a more day-to-day basis, you can take a look at what you're bringing into the house. Don't bring in soda, don't bring in juices. Those would be the main sources of added sugars. And then check your other foods that you are purchasing, check them for added sugar, and just try to find a peanut butter or a pasta sauce or a yogurt that doesn't have added sugar.
Yeah. And I think, doing that, it's 7 days. It's not, you're committing for only 7 days and you're just seeing what happens. I love that. And I love that approach. I've always said, Rome wasn't built in a day. You don't need to completely remove everything out on day one. And so, I love that 7-day challenge. I also love, replacing one product at a time. Don't go and throw away all the food. When one product ends, get something that doesn't have that added sugar. So, just to clarify, on the back of the packet, we've got our ingredient, or we've got our nutritional panel. You're referring to where it says total added sugars or added sugars on that nutritional panel. Yeah.
And that's a relatively new development. There is a line on the nutrition label now that says added sugars. So, for example, if you go look at a pot of yogurt, classic example, because yogurt has natural sugar from a dairy.
Yes.
Most yogurts will also have
loads of added sugar.
Sweeter. So, you don't have to buy the added sugar because they often don't taste good. They might even be more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
It's better to buy the no added sugar yogurt and spice it up yourself with a little bit of honey or some mashed banana or whatever sweet flavors your kids might like. That's what I like to do.
Yeah, no, and I like to do that as well. I like to put sort of more natural sugars like honey, I wouldn't put maple syrup in dairy-free yogurt, but, focus on those natural sugars like that honey, that maple syrup, dates, even fruit. Definitely love to mix sort of pureed fruit into that, the things that need a bit more sweetening. Now, one of the major issues I know that parents face is that sugar is just so pervasive. It's like in processed foods everywhere. What are some of the most sort of surprising sources of hidden sugars that you found or that parents should watch out for?
Yeah, I mean, 70% of processed foods or packaged foods contain some type of added sugar. The number is
70%.
and if you look at products just designed for children, infants and children, it's 80%. Yeah, so well, you mentioned already bread. That's often surprising to most people. There's plenty of breads. They tend to be the non-packaged or like, bakery loaves that don't have the added sugar. Sourdough is always a good example of bread that rarely has added sugar. Breads, yogurts again, another example. That's maybe not surprising, but tricky because it's often advertised as a healthy food. So, we're often kind of blindsided by it because, oh, it's yogurt, it's healthy.
Yep, definitely. And you touched on something a little bit earlier, which gets addressed with your 7-day challenge. And that is, when you eat more sugar, you crave more sugar. Can you could you just explain that concept? Why does that happen? Is it something happening in the brain around, dopamine? We talk about neurotransmitters on the podcast a bit because obviously dopamine and serotonin, our happy, feel good neurotransmitters, are very sort of talked about a lot when it comes to ADHD. So could you just explain a little bit further about that sort of addiction that happens around sugar? How does that occur?
Yeah, well, it is through the whole dopamine reward network. So it is being activated with sugar. So the body's then looking for, a continuation of that reward. The field is probably mixed in terms of whether, if you ask 10 experts, is sugar addictive? You'd probably get a mixture of responses.
Interesting.
My kind of more pragmatic answer to that is rather than getting bogged down on whether or not it's addictive, we know that it triggers addictive properties, right? So that's a given because if you try to stop consuming sugar, you get withdrawal effects. You want it, and if you don't take it, you might have headaches or fatigue. I mean, these are all withdrawal effects. That is one of the classic definitions of addiction. So sugar does have addictive properties, whether or not you want to call it addictive or not.
Yep, and I like your answer to that one. Very, very pragmatic, and I think that let's not go down arguing between the 10 different experts on whether or not it's addictive. If you have withdrawals from it, it's clearly showing that it has addictive properties. So thank you for sharing that. Now, finally, what message would you sort of like to leave with parents today, who are concerned about the role of sugar in their lives and their children's lives?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Rome wasn't built in a day, or as we say in tennis, because I'm watching a lot of tennis these days, one point at a time. So as a parent, it's one small step at a time is going to add up. Eventually, you might not be ready for the 7-day challenge, but maybe you're ready for a different pasta sauce or a different jar of peanut butter that doesn't have added sugar, or not buying juice or soda and bringing it into the house. All these small effects will eventually translate down the road. And so just kind of take it easy. There's a lot of other pressures on you as a parent. But these are, small things you can do day to day that will add up over time. And sugar proof is all about learning to navigate and live and thrive in the high sugar world. And the analogy I like to give there is we know that too much sun causes skin cancer. That doesn't mean to say you can't take your kid to the beach for the day, right? You can still get sun exposure and enjoy it.
Yes.
You take those precautionary steps. So the precautionary steps to be sugar-proof are just to kind of get a better appreciation and an understanding of what is in the different foods and how it's affecting the bodies of young people, and trying to modify it in ways that would be protective, not harmful.
Well, I think that's a great way to explain it. I love that analogy as well. Listeners know that I like to use analogies, so thank you for sharing that fantastic one. Look, we've heard from Michael today. You know, sugar isn't just an obvious culprit in our kids' diet. It's often hiding in places that we wouldn't expect, like bread. You know, while reducing sugar can feel overwhelming, I think, Michael, you've shared, some simple let's just start small and slow steps. You can start with the 7-day challenge. You can start doing one product at a time. But we're making these simple everyday changes to really start making changes that are going to protect our children's health, their brain health, and their growth. Michael, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. Please tell our listeners where they can find and follow you online.
Yeah, thank you for having me on today, and thank you to all your listeners. Yeah, you can follow us on Instagram at Sugarproof Kids. That's where we post often daily, or sugarproofkids.com is our website, and then the book is available. Should be available everywhere you're buying books in all formats.
Fantastic. Well, thank you once again, Michael. For those listening, if you're ready to start making positive changes in your family's diet, I definitely recommend picking up a copy of Sugarproof and just diving into the solutions that Michael lays out. As always, our goal here on the podcast is really to empower you with the knowledge and the tools to help your child thrive. Listeners, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of The Soaring Child. I'm Dana Kate, your ADHD health practitioner. Keep on thriving. Thank you for listening to the Soaring Child podcast today. To learn more about how to help your child with ADHD soar using natural strategies, visit our website at adhdthriveinstitute.com and follow us on social media at ADHD Thrive Institute.